Hello everyone, Rob Guest from football.london here, and welcome to the latest episode of Gold and Guest Talk Tottenham, sponsored by NordVPN. Joining me today, it's Lee Wilmot in Alistair Gold's absence, and we also have a special guest. We have the author of the Tottenham book, Is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack? Spurs in the 90s, Magic, Mayhem and Mediocrity. It's Gareth Dace. How are you both?
Very well, Guesty. Thank you for that introduction. And yeah, apologies that Alistair's not here. He's off on another holiday, but we've made up for it by getting a very special guest in Gareth. And how are you doing, Gareth? Great to have you with us.
Yeah, hi Lee, hi Rob, hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, I'm really good, thanks. Really looking forward to discussing a little bit more about Spurs in the 90s with you.
Yeah, so as it's the international break, we thought we'd do something a bit different today. We're stepping back into the 1990s, and fair to say, quite an up and down time for Tottenham. Started okay, pretty well actually, with an FA Cup. Ended with the League Cup at Wembley in 1999. But in between that period, I mean, so many ups and downs, and no surprise you ended up writing a book, because I mean, there's just so much material to talk about there.
There certainly was, yeah. And again, thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some of that here. But it was absolutely, as you just described there, a complete roller coaster of a decade. I lived through it, mostly through my teenage years, which for most of it meant I was going to school on Monday morning, with lots of Arsenal fans, which wasn't a good place to be for most of it. But it was, as the subtitle of the book is, a decade of magic, mayhem and mediocrity. And Lee, you may remember bits of the 90s as well, and of your own memories of it, but it was certainly all three of those things in fairly equal measures, actually.
It's my childhood, really. It's what I grew up on with Spurs. I first started really becoming a Spurs. I said to Guesty before, a little bit of a glory hunter in a way, because I first started with the 91 FA Cup final. I was 7 then. So that was when I first got into football and first got into Spurs, thanks to my family. And then, yeah, I thought, oh, this is great, because we'd gone through the 80s with Huddle and how good we were, and then the 91 FA Cup win. And yeah, as soon as I got into it, it was a decade that pretty much, as you say there, the perfect word probably to sum up my childhood supporting Spurs was mediocrity, really, apart from some of the incredible players that we brought in and some of the incredible football we tried to play and failed miserably to do so, I think, really.
Yeah.
And obviously, we'll start with the FA Cup in 1991. The year ending in 1, Spurs always seem to do really well in.
Used to.
I mean, they had the opportunity 3 years ago, didn't they, in the Carabao Cup at Wembley against City, and you're thinking, might do this, but didn't end up happening. But they did win the FA Cup in 91 against Forest. Bit of a memorable game, that. Not just for Spurs winning the cup. Paul Gascoigne playing for Spurs, doing his cruciate ligament in his right knee, bad tackle on Gary Charles. Fair to say, an eventful day for Tottenham at Wembley.
Before Gareth goes into any of it, never did I think, watching that final, that would be the last time. Well, I've got to 40 now. That would be the last time we'd won the FA Cup, and I can't. It's just unbelievable, really.
Yeah, well, I was there that day. I was 10, so I'm a few years older than you, Lee. And I think, like you, I watched that and the outcome of it, and just assumed, well, this will be exactly like the 80s, where I've read about this sort of Ricky Villa goal from 81, and I know that Spurs won it the following year and won UEFA Cup after that. So yeah, you as an innocent 10-year-old, perhaps not really aware of what was going on in the macro climate of Tottenham Hotspur at the time, the assumption was that this was going to be the start of another really, really glorious decade. But yeah, I mean, that day of the cup final, I was there. I can remember my dad surprising me a couple of weeks beforehand to show me that he'd got us a couple of tickets for it. It was a great cup final as well. I mean, of course, this was an era when the FA Cup final was still right up there as probably the most significant day in the domestic football calendar. So you had all these narratives going into it. So it was Venables against Brian Clough, who famously never won the FA Cup as a player or as a manager. We all knew by this point it was going to be Gascoigne's last game as a Spurs player, and was he going to go out in a blaze of glory. And of course, infamously, as you've alluded to there, Rob, he got injured quite early on. He ruptured his cruciate ligament, which I guess in many ways was a fairly symbolic ending for Gascoigne's career at Spurs and what was to come for him throughout the rest of the 90s. But that was a day where the undercard really came to the fore. So Gascoigne went off. Lineker, who was our other star of that team, had a penalty saved. He had a goal wrongly disallowed for offside. So our two best players suffered quite a bit of adversity, but it was the likes of David Howells, Vinnie Samways, Gary Mabbott, Paul Stewart, who scored the equaliser, who really were the ones who got us home and got us over the line that day.
In terms of then a year on, just over a year on, the dawn of the Premier League, 1992, Spurs finished 8th. That season, I mean, you started with the high of winning the FA Cup in 91, then things just started to go a bit downhill. Why was that? It
was so after Gascoigne left and then Lineker left and Paul Stewart left as well. There was a period of rebuild. So it was a really transitional season that first year in the Premier League, 92-93. Whereas I think, and Lee, I know you're a couple of years younger than me, so it didn't really feel from what you were watching on the pitch that the Premier League was anything different from what we'd known before as the old Division 1. So you couldn't see that this sort of slick product was sort of coming down the line as the Premier League, or as we knew the football to become by the end of the decade. But it was, from a Spurs perspective, it was a really good team, that 92-93, that just needed a bit of time to click. So there were some really horrendous results right at the start of the season. I remember us getting beaten 5-0 up at Leeds in the August. And we were in sort of mid to lower table for much of 92. But once that front three of Sheringham, Anderton and Barnby really clicked into place in spring 93, we had a really, really good team. They were scoring lots of goals. We went on a really good run of results. We should have gone further in the FA Cup. We were really unfortunate. We played Arsenal again in the semi-final that year. And I think one of the great Spurs injustices of my lifetime was Darren Anderton not being given a penalty at 0-0. And if we'd have won that, I'm pretty confident we'd have gone on to beat Sheffield Wednesday in the final. And that, again, changes the narrative for what would have happened for Spurs in the 90s as we went on. So, yeah, the 8th place, I think, was largely as a result of having a pretty slow start to the year. But, the second half, it did really pick up. So I think at the end of that season, we all felt as a fan base that, this was a team on the rise. They weren't quite ready to win a league title at that point, but you felt it was a good team. There was a good nucleus there. And with Terry Venables in charge of the team, you thought, what could possibly go wrong?
And then I'd consign that to memory then. I'd almost forgotten until you reminded me there that we got to the semi-final that year and lost to Arsenal.
Yeah, no, we did. We had a good run. We had a really iconic quarter-final at Manchester City, who, of course, are a very different entity as the one that they are now. But we won up there 4-2. Naeem scored a hat-trick. There was the pitch invasion. The City fans tried to get on the pitch. It was a really, really memorable period, a really positive sort of 6 to 8 weeks probably in our time during the 90s.
Why didn't things go quite right the following season then? Because you were 15th in the table. Yeah,
so again, looking back to that subtitle of the book, Magic, Mayhem and Mediocrity, this is the mayhem element of it. Because at the end of that season, having finished really positively, Alan Sugar, who has been our chairman for a couple of years, people didn't really know much about him. He was very much the silent partner in the Sugar and Venables partnership. And Sugar sacked Terry Venables as chief executive for largely, almost entirely non-footballing reasons. And certainly, all of the players, almost to a man, were all behind Terry Venables. He had really been the attraction. So, Darren Anderton talks very affectionately about why he came to Spurs in the first place, and that was the vision that Terry Venables had sold him. Neil Ruddock, who we'd had a great season of, he'd come back from Southampton. He was now on the fringes of the England team. He was a staunch Venables man. So it wasn't even that the camp was completely split down the middle. It was everyone was with Venables, who'd been ousted, and the fan base as well. I was exactly the same as 12 years old at the time. I didn't really know any better, but for me, Terry Venables was the only manager I'd known at Spurs. He'd won us the FA Cup. He was this larger than life, very, very charismatic figure, and Alan Sugar got rid of him, and it was a really, really chaotic summer of '93, because this all got then played out in the courts, that Venables tried to get reinstated and initially did, and then Sugar took them back to court, and this was the lead news article on the sort of the evening news at the time. You could see all these bays and mobs of fans there trying to get at Sugar, because they were so adamant that they wanted Venables in charge, and that Sugar, you know, he described it as like shooting Bambi, and he wrote that in his book actually when Venables went. So this is how that summer building into that 93-94 season, rather than it being this continuation of this really good and promising team that we'd seen, it was all ripped up. And I think the ramifications of that lived much longer into the 90s than probably anyone realised at the time.
When was that all going on? Because we actually started the season pretty well, didn't we? Considering everything that was going on with Terry Venables leaving.
So Ozzy Ardiles came in, and I mean, you could cynically say this was just a PR piece. So what do? You've got rid of you've shot Bambi, to use his analogy. Bringing back a club legend in Ozzy Ardiles is obviously going to appease the fans to some extent, or at least the ire that might otherwise have been there is going to be diluted somewhat. And we did start the season really well. We won at Newcastle, who'd just come up to the Premier League, and there was all this fanfare around Newcastle in the northeast at the time, and we went there and won 1-0. We gained a very, very rare victory at Anfield early on in the season. Teddy scored a couple of times up there, so we started the season well. To some extent, the positive form from the back end of the season came into 93-94, but it all went wrong. Fateful. In fact, it was on this day, the 16th of October, 1993. We went up to Old Trafford. It was one of the few away games that I went to, and United were champions at the time, and were, again, they'd started the season well, as Spurs had. We went up there, really thinking this is a showdown. This could be a real statement victory for us. And unfortunately, Teddy got injured. He picked up a knee injury. He suffered a couple of fairly robust challenges from Brian Robson and limped off. And we lost the game 2-1 in the end. And I think off the back of that, every week we were told, oh, Teddy will be back next week. It'll be a couple of weeks away. It turned out we didn't see him for another 6 months. And it really set the tone for a season. There were lots of injuries. Gary Mabbutt had his eye socket fractured in a challenge with John Fashanu. Players lost confidence, I think, very, very quickly. And before we knew it, we go into 1994, go and lose 7 games on the spin in January and February. Can't score a goal, missed 3 penalties across sort of 90 minutes of football, and then find ourselves in a relegation battle.
You mentioned that Manchester United game. Actually, I have to bring it up. It was actually the game after my first game at White Hart Lane, which was a 3-2 win against Everton, Guesty, with Darren Caskey scoring in something like the 93rd minute after we'd been trailing 2-1 for most of the game. I was almost in tears as a 9-year-old in my first game, and then finally he scored an equaliser in 2 minutes from time or something like that, and then Caskey popped up with a winner in injury time.
Thanks for bringing that
up. I thought I had to.
You'll get your own back though, won't you, Guess?
Yeah. A couple of minutes I will be. And then we'll move on to the summer of 1994. And after the struggles of the previous season, I mean, this was a real positive for Spurs going into the campaign. Jurgen Klinsmann, such a superstar in the game, proved to be, a really, really good signing for Spurs that year. Prolific partnership with Teddy Sheringham up front, and this was a period when Shearer and Sutton were scoring goals for fun at Blackburn as well. Just how much of a lift did the signing of Klinsmann give everyone going into 94-95?
Incredible. And I would say, as a teenager, this was one of my defining Spurs memories of the whole decade. So we'd only just avoided relegation. When I say only just, literally only just, we had to win at Oldham in the penultimate game of the season to stay up. We then got deducted 12 points and were banned from the FA Cup for a year because of some financial irregularities that had been uncovered through. This was the pre-Sugar era, so nothing to do with him. So this is the team that's just avoided relegation, been given a 12-point ban, thrown out the FA Cup already. So expectations and hopes were at an absolute low at that time. And I can remember flicking on teletext which I guess some listeners of you won't know what teletext is. So that's perhaps something to Google in itself. But it was a primitive form of the internet. It's probably the best way to describe it.
We all used to be hooked to it for the football scores if we weren't at a match.
We did before the days when we could constantly follow Ali's updates on what was going on in the transfer window. There's none of this at the time. And yeah, so I found out on teletext that Spurs had signed Jurgen Klinsmann, who was just straight off the back of the 1994 World Cup, I would say the most high-profile centre forward anywhere in world football at the time. And the fact that he was coming to the Premier League in England was a huge thing. I mean, I think this was a Premier League defining moment, actually, that suddenly the league was able to attract this global talent rather than going to Italy or to Spain or to Germany. This was a player coming to England, but he was coming to Tottenham as well. And he signed, and then we basked in, I guess, what I described as Klinsmania probably for about 6 weeks through until the start of the season, where all the talk was about Jurgen Klinsmann. So people weren't talking about Chris Sutton, who'd completed a record transfer signing to Blackburn for $5 million. It was Jurgen Klinsmann who suddenly everyone was talking about. We had a pre-season game at Watford, and they had to lock the doors because there was such huge interest in the game that Spurs fans, non-Spurs fans wanted to see this guy playing, and that then filled into the start of the season, and he scored on his debut. Then he gave the iconic Klinsmann dive in celebration at having scored the winner for that, and that set the tone for what was. I mean, you say the 90s as a decade was a roller coaster, but the 94-95 season, if you take that alone, that in itself was just a soap opera.
It's almost akin to what Man City have done in recent terms, isn't it? But not without all the without the millions and millions and millions. Yes, we were obviously fined for financial irregularities back then, but the fact that we brought in Georgi Popescu and Ili Dumitrescu and Jurgen Klinsmann, there was just a real furore around Spurs at that time. And it was being a child supporting Spurs then, even though the last couple of seasons have been pretty dire. It was so exciting to be a Spurs fan at that point.
I was just going to mention Popescu and Dumitrescu, who had come off the back of a really, really good World Cup with Romania, who, sprung quite a surprise in the United States. But I think their time at Tottenham pretty much backs up what a lot of people say: don't sign players off the back of a positive World Cup. It didn't quite go to plan for them.
No, it didn't. So Dumitrescu was the first player we signed. So he came in before Klinsmann. And we probably all remembered that he'd scored 2 goals against Argentina in the knockout stages. So that in itself was a really exotic signing. Again, foreign players in the Premier League just wasn't a thing at the time. Cantonard's probably the only real outlier as any non-Scandinavian. It's a couple of Scandinavian players. So we had Erik Torstvedt at Spurs, but beyond that, you didn't have many exotic names. So the fact that Dumitrescu came in and say then Klinsmann, I think Popescu was slightly different. I mean, he was a deep lying midfielder who could also play in defence. So he perhaps wasn't as glamorous a player, but he was a really, really classy player. Don't get me wrong. He scored the winner against Arsenal in the North London derby that year. So he immediately endeared himself to the home crowd. I mean, he left us to join Barcelona at the end of that season. Probably he and his agent saw Tottenham as a bit of a stepping stone, and no doubt the fact that Klinsmann and Dumitrescu were there already added to that appeal.
But people talk about Ange now and his kind of no nonsense attacking football. We're not going to defend. We'll score more goals than you. I've just got the results from that season. That 94-95, 4-3, 3-1. 4-1, 3-1, 5-2, another 4-3, 4-2. There's a 4-0 in there. There's a 3-0, another 4-3, a third 4-3 that is. 3-all, 3-1. It was just incredible. Just the way Ozzy Ardiles just like, yeah, we'll go out, we'll go and play our football. Klinsmann, Sheringham, Barmby, Anderton. We'll just play all these players up front and we'll just try and outscore you, essentially. It's been done before, so what Ange is doing now is no different to what's been done before at Spurs, really.
I mean, were they known as, was it like the Fab Front Five or something like that? Fabulous Front Five.
The famous five. So this conversation was quite well documented, and I've included it within the book. That I think Teddy Sheringham went to Aussie on the first day of pre-season, or once these guys had signed, and said, "Well, what are we going to? You got me, Darren Anderton, Nick Barmby. We've now signed Dumitrescu and Klinsmann, you know, what are you going to do? And Ozzy said, well, just pick all of you. And his rationale was very much, look, you're all great players, just don't lose the ball and it won't be a problem. And for the first few weeks of the season, that was exactly how it played out. It wasn't one of those that stands out. It probably wasn't one of the scores that you would have seen there, Liam suggested, but we won a game 3-1 at Ipswich very early on in the season. And I've got a couple of first-hand accounts of people who were at that game who were just mesmerised by the pace and the tempo and the movement and the fluidity. And 3-1 really wasn't a reflection. I think it was 3-0 at half time, but I think Darren Anderson wrote in his book that, you know, really it could have been 10-0 by half time. But there were some incredible scorelines. You know, unfortunately, probably the tactics weren't quite as sophisticated as they needed to be. But in many ways, I think, you know, Ozzy was well ahead of his time. And I've subsequently spoke to Steve Pierre-Emile, who was his assistant manager, and said really the things that Ozzy did there were successful for him later on in his career, and they were very much the things that most managers try and do nowadays. It was getting more players in front of the ball. I heard Klinsmann give a really good interview, actually, which again I've used secondhand within the book, and he said at that time forwards weren't really spoken to. They weren't given the same granular level of detail that they would be given now tactically about what they do off the ball. And he said that if Teddy and I had known that or given that a bit more thought, we could have alleviated a lot of pressure that was put on our defence at the time. So it was probably tactics that were slightly ahead of their time.
We probably need to speak about the FA Cup run that year as well. I know Guesty's itching to talk about it. But before we get into the match that Guesty really wants to talk about, there was a couple of incredible results in the lead up to that. I'll always remember being at home in my bedroom, trying to listen. I think I was supposed to be asleep, listening to the radio for the Southampton game, which had gone to extra time, obviously, and that fateful Ronnie Rosenthal hat-trick in the second half, and then extra time. That 6-2 win was just unbelievable. And then to go to Anfield and win 2-1 with Klinsmann and Sheringham both scoring in the quarter-final to set up the semi-final. It was at that, then I was thinking, well, we're going to go all the way here. Obviously, it didn't happen, did it, Guesty?
No, I was actually going to mention the date, Sunday, April the 9th. Does that ring any bells? In 1995. Everton 4-1 win over Spurs at Ellen Road. Everton fans, I think, filled the stadium free. I think it was pretty much free stands. Everyone always talks about. And that was actually the first, I think, full 90 minutes of football I ever watched. And not a bad one from an Everton perspective. Just, a life full of disappointment and misery after the FA Cup win over Manchester United. But no, great day for Everton, but not a good one for Spurs and you two.
I would say in my 35 plus years now of following Spurs, that is the most disappointing afternoon that we've ever suffered. You said it really well, Lee. Effectively, our name was on the cup going into that game. We'd won at Anfield. Of course, the cup that we'd been banned from at the start of the season. It wasn't until December that we got reinstated back into it. And you had this magical team. And I think lots of teams who win cups, probably like that Everton that year, they do rely on particular players who are match winners who can win those one-off games. Those teams often aren't consistent enough to do that well in the league, but they'll have match winners. And obviously in Sheringham and Klinsmann in particular, we had those. You even had your wild cards like Rosenthal, who, as you said, came off the bench and scored a hat-trick against Southampton. I don't think there's been a more dramatic Spurs hat-trick until Lucas Moura in Amsterdam a few years ago. I think those are the sorts of levels we're talking about here. But yeah, that Everton game, it was just a game where, I've spoken to Jerry Francis within the book, who was the manager, and you just got the feeling that it just wasn't destined to happen for Spurs. So the day before the Grand National took place, and it was won by a 40-1 outsider. And what was its name? Royal Athlete. I mean, what's the chances of a horse called Royal Athlete winning the Grand National the day before an Everton team who were effectively 40-1 outsiders managed by Joe Royal turn up and win by 4-1? But we had a couple of injury problems, so we didn't have a recognised left back that day. Justin Edinburgh was suspended. Sol Campbell was was injured. So Stuart Nethercott, who was a very much a right-sided central defender, ended up playing on the left-hand side. And Everton, to be fair to them, they picked us apart, and they worked out how to play against Spurs, and we made a couple of errors in the game, and Everton, quite rightly on the day, deserved to win, and I would say deserved to go and win the final as well.
Oh yeah, I would, because my dad's an Everton fan, so my Spurs support comes from my mum's side of the family, much to my dad's disgust, obviously. But yeah, he's an Everton fan, so I was rooting for Everton in the final. But you're right, it did feel like it was one of those times where I thought we were going to go and win it, just because we had been banned from the competition and then reinstated, essentially, to have that comeback win against Southampton when we looked dead and buried, to then go and win at Anfield. It just looked like, oh, we can brush aside Everton, because Everton are Everton are about as good, nowhere near as good as we are at that point in the 90s. And yeah, it was really disappointing that day, but great for you, Guesty, obviously.
Yeah, well, I think that was a season of struggle for Everton. The previous year, they'd stayed up on the last day. You mentioned it before we came on the pod about winning over Wimbledon and that powerful
had the hand Sagers.
Yeah, that Hans Sagers couldn't save. But reading a book about it previously, it did sound like everyone, the media, just wanted the Spurs versus Manchester United FA Cup final.
Yeah, it did feel like that. I think maybe Jimmy Hill on Match of the Day described it in advance of that would be the people's final. Yeah. But yeah, it didn't turn out. That's how football and life treat you sometimes. But there was, certainly from talking to Jerry Francis, he didn't feel that there was any complacency within the team or the squad going into the game. They knew that Everton were a really tough opponent, and they'd given them a really good game. I think it'd been 0-0 at good, as a very, very rare 0-0 for Spurs that season, just before Christmas. So they were in no doubt that they were in for a really tough test that day. But yeah, I think for supporters, we all expected to win. We were all anticipating that final against Manchester United.
It's just one of the many, many occasions in my life where I've grown to hate Tottenham in semi-finals. Just awful.
Yeah,
well, I think Ali's mentioned to me before, he went to this semi-final at Ellen Road and then missed the bus coming back or something, so he had to find another way to get home from Ellen Road.
How would you miss the bus? I would have been desperate to get out of there.
I don't know. Before we move on to the second half of the 90s, and there's plenty more ups and downs still to come, as Ali's not here, Lee's going to tell us about the benefits of using our sponsor NordVPN.
And yeah, you would think, well, he's not yet. I think he's on his way. I think he was at the airport earlier when I spoke to him. So he's probably not using NordVPN yet. But I imagine in his downtime in North America, he will be using the benefits of NordVPN. Because if you're not aware by now, the Golden Guest Talk Tottenham podcast is sponsored by NordVPN, and you can use the service in a host of different ways to enhance your internet experience. NordVPN is the fastest VPN in the world, and that means there's no buffering, no lagging, and you can stream your favorite shows from anywhere in the world without your bandwidth throttling. You can use Nord to set your device to thinking it's back in the UK and just watch them as normal. Not only that, but the outlay on the NordVPN subscription is cheaper for you in the long run, and that's because you can purchase streaming services in other countries at a much cheaper rate. So, for example, you can change your virtual location to Canada, which is where Ali's going at the minute, or even the US. And you can maybe book flights from there or any other country you want to book flights from. Also, security-wise, it's a great system for pretty much going as far as you possibly can to stop people from stealing things off your devices if you connect to a public Wi-Fi. It's such a clever app that you can install on any device that you've got, quite frankly, and it is very easy to set up and get you straight on and going with it. There's a whole host of other benefits from signing up to NordVPN, so why not give it a go? To get the best discount off your NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/goldguest. Our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in our episode description box.
The summer of 95 now, about just earlier before the ad, we mentioned about all the positivity at Tottenham heading into 94, 95. Bit different, 12 months on. Jurgen Klinsmann had left after a year at the club. Chris Armstrong had come in, who was a very good player at Crystal Palace, scored a number of goals for the Eagles. Just what was the mood like then heading into that season?
It was, I mean, that summer of '95, I think it was really, really palpable at the time that you felt Spurs had just lost their magic dust and prominence that summer. So Klinsmann left at the end of the year. He'd had a clause in his contract that allowed him to leave after one of the 2 years. He went back to Bayern Munich. Popescu left as well. I think even more critically, Nick Barmby went in to see Jerry Francis during pre-season to say that he was home. He and his girlfriend were homesick and were desperate to relocate back up to the northeast. So he was sold very reluctantly to Middlesbrough. So Chris Armstrong came in, and I think Chris Armstrong is perhaps much maligned, but I wanted to make sure in the book that he was remembered more positively, because he did eventually. He came in and he formed a really, really good partnership with Teddy Sheringham. But I think whoever was going to come in that summer, they were always going to be a downgrade on Jurgen Klinsmann, because how can you possibly match that excitement and the profile of Jurgen Klinsmann with all that he achieved? And I think we all hoped that Dennis Bergkamp was going to be coming to Spurs that summer, because he was the striker who people knew about. Say the prospect for really talented foreign players coming to England were far greater as a result of Klinsmann coming the year before that. And I think Alan Sugar had his fingers burned so badly from the Klinsmann deal and from Popescu and from Dumitrescu that this is where he coined the phrase about Carlos Kickaballs and described Bergkamp as being another piece, just a piece of cosmetic marketing for Arsenal. And so we ended up with Chris Armstrong instead of Klinsmann. We ended up with Rolf Fox instead of Nick Barmby. We even changed our kit manufacturer. So from having Umbro, who were this sort of well-known manufacturer producing England kits and Man United kits, and all kids in school, whether you supported Spurs or those teams or not, you had a bit of Umbro merchandise. Suddenly we had pony kits instead, who no one had heard of. And all these things happened in the same summer. So Holston, who were our iconic shirt sponsors as well, were also replaced by Hewlett-Packard. So it just felt, from Spurs being on the forefront of everyone in the football media's mind and attentions, suddenly we were on the undercard very, very quickly.
Those pony kits are like quite iconic now. Everyone loves retro football shirts, and I'm sure I've seen the purple one that's in the Spurs club shop. And I mean, Southampton and West Ham had them at the time. I think their certainly home shirts were a lot bolder than Tottenham's, but I think in this day and age now, everyone's just going back to those retro shirts, and especially the pony ones.
It didn't help when you're going to school and you're supplied by pony, and it became a word that was associated with negative connotations when you're at school.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was the. I was just going to say. So you talk about how everything changed that year as well. That was the fateful Intertoto Cup summer as well, wasn't it? I was just looking. Yeah, it was. So Spurs had almost sort of taken one for the team, really, on behalf of the Premier League by putting themselves in for this Intertoto Cup. So this was a brand new competition the UEFA had launched, and it was to gain qualification into the UEFA Cup, or Europa League as we now know it. And UEFA wanted 3 teams to take part in it, and Spurs were the sort of next team who hadn't qualified for the UEFA Cup. So we only just missed out to Leeds and league placing. So I still don't know why Wimbledon and Sheffield Wednesday were the other 2 that were selected to go into it, but they did. And as far as Jerry Francis and Alan Sugar were concerned, they'd been given a cast iron assurance that they could go and play in this Intertoto Cup. They could field a team of youth team players. They didn't even have to play at White Hart Lane. They could just play it, really, just so that the Premier League could fulfil its quota of having 3 teams in the competition. So they did exactly that. They picked a load of reserve team players, youth team players. They even went out and picked up a load of free agents and transfers, including infamously Alan Pardew, who I think had just been released from his contract by Charlton in the 2nd division at the time, just so they could get an 11 out. So it was nothing to do with the first team. They played their games at Brighton's stadium, and they won 1 and lost 3 games, including what is unofficially the biggest defeat in the club's history, which was an 8-0 defeat to Cologne in Germany, who fielded Bodo Illgner, who was the World Cup winning goalkeeper and captain. So Spurs were knocked out of it.
in the group stage without really giving it a second thought. So the first team were on a pre-season tour in Scandinavia, whilst these games were going on around sort of far outposts of Eastern and Central Europe in many cases. But of course, it came back to bite Spurs on the bum, because they were then fined by UEFA and provisionally given a year's ban for fielding a weakened side. Now, that was later overturned, and the fine was actually shared across all Premier League clubs. But I don't think many clubs or many fans knew that this competition was even going on at the time. I don't know, Gisty. I don't know. Would you have been delegated to go and watch Spurs play RK Vader in Slovenia while Ali was out doing the pre-season with the first team in?
I think Ali had probably tried to go to both, to be honest, but there you go. Just 95, 96, finished 8th. I think you were 2 points off 5th. It was really close. I think it was like Villa, Everton, Blackburn, maybe. Yeah. Spurs. Just a couple of notable things from that season that I can remember. Teddy Sheringham scored a brilliant goal at Coventry. The chip, I think, was it Chris Armstrong chested down to him.
Hodlesk.
Lifted it over. It'd been the Grizovic in there at the time. And then there was a famous FA Cup match at Nottingham Forest. I think that was on BBC at the time. And you just couldn't see any of the action just because of this snow, which was just incredible.
It was, He got abandoned after about 20 minutes. And I think any fans going to the game that had travelled up the M1, knew there was no chance this game was going to finish if it started. And it got abandoned after 20 minutes. It was a bit of an epic, because when the game was replayed at the City Ground the following week, it was a really exciting 2-2 draw. Ian Wone, who sort of joins this list of players who really end up aggravating Spurs during the 90s, just because they end up scoring these sort of worldies or important goals, scored 2 incredible free kicks. But we drew 2-2, took them back to White Hart Lane, and that was an epic fixture as well that ended up going to extra time and then penalties, and Spurs got beaten on penalties. Mark Crossley was Forest's hero that day, so we got knocked out in the in the 5th round. But I think statistically that the 94-95 and then the 95-6 season, they're actually very, very similar in terms of the points and the league positions. And in fact, Sheringham and Armstrong's goal scoring record is identical. It's literally identical to the Sheringham-Klinsmann one, but just the sort of the difference in feel and vibes, certainly amongst the fans between those 2 seasons, is really palpable.
The following season, not as good, finished 10th, and it's probably no surprise you're finishing that low in the table when Teddy Sheringham's your top scorer and he's only managing 7 goals that campaign. What didn't quite go as planned that year? And
it was a bit of a perfect storm, really. I mean, this is really when the mediocrity really sort of festers around Spurs that year. Chris Armstrong got injured 2 games into the season. He did his ankle against Everton, actually. I think he slipped, running off the cinders on the immediate off-field perimeter, and he did come back, but I would say arguably he never really recovered from that. So having scored 20 odd goals in his first season, that incredible pace he had, we just didn't have. Darren Anderton suffered a number of injuries that season, and injuries was the tone for that year. We signed players. We signed Everson, who got injured within a couple of weeks. We signed John Scales so we could play a back 3, and he got injured without actually having played a first team game and missed about 6 weeks. We suffered some really heavy losses. We lost 6-1 at Bolton in the League Cup at the end of November, and unfortunately it was just, I guess, one of those things that could happen. But it was 4 days after we'd lost to Arsenal at Highbury. It was the first time that Wenger had led an Arsenal team in the North London derby. First time Jerry Francis had lost a game against Arsenal as a manager as well. And you could see that Arsenal were on this trajectory, and Spurs, unfortunately, were going in the opposite direction at the time. So it was just injury after injury that affected confidence. And by the end of the season, I think everyone was just thoroughly fed up, including Jerry himself.
7-1 at Newcastle just after Christmas summed it up for me that season. Just awful.
That was the amusing, and it is amusing now looking back at it. If you find this clip on YouTube or the end of season VHS, it was 7-0, and Alan Nilsson scores our consolation in injury time. And having scored, he then goes and retrieves the ball from the back of the net and runs it back to the halfway line.
Was that the game at Newcastle? Was it Rule Fox and someone else got stuck in the toilets in the changing room?
I think that was a home. That was against Newcastle. So That was Les Ferdinand was the other one stuck in the toilet. Les Ferdinand was a Newcastle player in that game who scored 2 of the goals against us. So yeah, the infamous toilet incident was a couple of years after that.
You do mention Gareth though. I love Stefan Everson I didn't really score the amount of goals that we would have liked him to score, but it was that he scored a hat trick against Sunderland that season, which was a great hat trick and really brought him to the fore. Made me love him even more, the Norwegian striker.
Yeah, it was a real coup when we signed him. I mean, this was this kid who was being sort of touted around Europe, and supposedly Barcelona and Juventus and Man United were interested in him. And we were, and Jerry Francis told me he was on a flight after every game we played and traveling somewhere to watch Everson play. Rosenberg had this totally unexpected run in the Champions League this year, which probably delayed him leaving them and joining us. So he joined us with this huge fanfare and expectation that we had effectively sort of signed Europe's next big prestigious centre forward. And say he had some injury problems and obviously never really lived up to those expectations. There were a few good moments, including that hat-trick at Sunderland. He scored a winner against Arsenal at White Hart Lane right at the end of the decade as well. But yeah, I mean, as it turned out, Man United got Solskjaer not long after that, and he was actually the young Norwegian centre-forward who was going to go on and really make a name for himself.
97-98 then, you mentioned season before that's when Wenger came in at Arsenal, both clubs going in different directions, and that was pretty much the exact what happened, because Arsenal won the league in 97-98. Spurs almost went down. So having a look at the table, I think 4 points away from Bolton, who went down on the final day after losing at Chelsea. And Spurs really needed a bit of a late rally in the final few weeks of the season. And I think what helped was the return of Jurgen Klinsmann. Not only that, he signed 2 fantastic players from Newcastle in the summer, Sir Les Ferdinand and David Ginola as well. And then also in the season, you've got Christian Gross appointed as manager. Infamous press conference with his London Underground travel card. I mean, that was really a season of downs, really.
I mean, again, talk about roller coaster rides. Roller coaster rides with not many ups on it. Actually, it started somewhere in the middle and then went downhill pretty quickly from there. So yeah, you had Jerry Francis left on his own accord. Christian Gross took over. Again, it's one of those many things where you look back and you can kind of see the sense of it from Sugar's perspective, that he'd seen the initial success that Wenger was having at Arsenal. He was trying to suddenly look at the continent and look at some continental innovations. And this guy, Christian Gross, he'd been told about and was a sort of a disciplinarian, and he got teams really fit, and he would bring across some of these innovations that Spurs were looking for. But yeah, he really put himself behind the 8 ball right from the start with that, the infamous press conference where he brandished this train ticket and said, I hope this is the ticket to my dreams. And then I think if you do something like that, you've got to have a really good start. And unfortunately for Christian Gross, I say start, we did actually win a game at Goodison. That was officially his first game. He'd come in, we won 2-0 up there. And then a first home game at home to Chelsea. Again, you talk about changing dynamics in London football. Arsenal were already streaking ahead of us. Chelsea were now sort of occupying Spurs space. Just in the players they were signing, they'd bought Hullet initially, then Vialli, Zola, LeBoeuf, Di Matteo. So probably all these exotic attacking players that traditionally Spurs would have signed were going to Chelsea. So we played them in this fairly seminal game at White Hart Lane, and they beat us 6-1. It was 1-1 at half time, but the way we collapsed in the second half when Chelsea scored the second and third, it was exactly what you'd expect when a manager's on his way out and the players have totally given up on him. But this was a bloke who'd been in charge for about 10 days at that time. So we lost 6-1 at home to Chelsea, followed that up by losing 4-0 at Coventry, and then all of a sudden we're actually in the relegation zone.
I've got nothing to say. I've got nothing to say about that.
Well, just looking at that season as well, a few of the other signings, I think Jose Dominguez, Nicola Berti, a couple of your favourites there, Lee.
Little Jose was one of my favourites growing up. Yeah, just watching him on the ball and the kind of the flair. He was Tottenham through and through, just the way he would play football and just show off the tricks, show off the skills, the kind of Glenn Hoddle that we've been brought up on. yeah, it's a shame he didn't quite have the magical talent that it looked like he had. But yeah, he was just a little magician sometimes with the ball.
Yeah, that's it. Well, you mentioned a couple of cult heroes. There's Jose Dominguez and Nicola Berti. He's a player, you know, in a day and age where not many of our players have songs that get sung on the terraces. Nicola Berti, if you go to any away games, you'll hear on the away concourses people singing the Nicola Berti song. It's lasted best part of 30 years.
And then, obviously, that season as well, the return of Klinsmann. Given everything, you know, what was happening, just how much of a lift did that give everyone at the time? It was a huge lift. I do think that Alan Sugar did have a sense for these sorts of things and what they could do, and certainly signing Klinsmann when we were in this horrible relegation battle. It was 2 days before Christmas. I mean, this was every Spurs supporter's Christmas, I guess. Klinsmann coming back. I suppose it's slightly akin to Bale when he came back a couple of years ago. But if you can imagine if Bale had come back when Spurs were in the relegation zone, just the lift that would have given everyone. That was what Klinsmann did. I mean, it became quite apparent that he wasn't the player that we'd seen a couple of years ago. He was into his probably early to mid-30s at the time. He wasn't as sharp as we'd seen him before. But, you know, ultimately it was his 4 goals against Wimbledon in May that kept us up that season.
Yeah, he scored some crucial goals, didn't he? In the end, he really did. He was seen as the saviour, and it wasn't as good as he was before, but he effectively did save the club with his goals.
Yeah. I think, was it 9 goals, 18 games? I mean, that's what you want from a signing when you're struggling to come in and just make an impact. And yeah, certainly did that away at Wimbledon. An improvement the following year, 11th, but we saw a bit of a, was it controversial appointment at the time?
Oh, yeah.
George Graham crossing the divide. Done so well at Arsenal. I think it was at Leeds, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was,
to Spurs, and then ended up coming to Spurs. So what were your thoughts on that then at the time?
It was one that really divided opinion, you know, actually, because I think the desperation amongst not just the fans, but clearly in the boardroom as well, that Spurs needed to have some success. Now, Arsenal had won the double by that point. And George, apart from Alex Ferguson, George Graham was the biggest guarantor of winning something. I mean, that's just what he'd done at Arsenal. But the trade-off with that was it was going to be very, very pragmatic defensive football, in very much the complete antithesis of everything that Spurs were supposed to be about in terms of free-flowing, swashbuckling, to dare us to do football. George Graham was exactly the opposite of that, and he'd really embodied that when Arsenal had won things. So at the start of the decade, when Arsenal won everything, you know, the one thing as a Spurs fan you could say is, but at least we play proper football at Spurs. So there you are with a complete role reversal, that, you know, Arsenal are winning things and they're playing this really good, stylish football with players like Bergkamp and Overmars in the team. And then sort of we're there and we're not winning anything, but we're playing this sort of really pragmatic, you know, literally Arsenal football. But we did, I think, compared to what we'd seen in the 2 years prior to that, when George Graham first came in, he did instill this real sense of togetherness around the squad, and you started to see this sort of real battling qualities in the team, and we were getting sort of quite decent results. So that League Cup run that resulted in us, you know, winning the trophy at the end of the year, it included a 3-1 win against Manchester United in the quarter-final, who, albeit they weren't taking it completely seriously, but they would have had a very strong side out that night. So Tottenham stopped Man United winning the quadruple in 99 by winning that League Cup tie. We also won at Anfield on the run. We had a league game against Man United where we were 2-0 down and scored twice fairly late on. So he definitely instilled something into the team that wasn't there beforehand. But I think we always knew with George Graham it would be fine until we stopped winning, and that's what then happens the season after that.
Nothing sums George Graham up more than the results in January and February of that year. I'll just read them out to you. Sheffield Wednesday away, 0-0. Wimbledon at home, 0-0. Blackburn Rovers away, 1-1. Coventry City at home, 0-0. Middlesbrough away, 0-0. Derby at home, 1-1. What a couple of months that is.
Well, at least you weren't losing.
Yeah.
So you won the Worthington Cup, which bookended the decade really well, winning the FA Cup in 91 and then winning the Worthington Cup at Wembley in 99. Were you there that day when Alan Nielsen scored, Gareth?
Yeah, I was. This was a really big moment for me as a 18-year-old. I was in sixth form at the time, so it's the first time that I'd bought cup final tickets with my own money. I can remember a very anxious wait then, because as a club member, you got entered into this this sort of nebulous ballot scheme, and it wasn't until I went to the ATM cash machine the week beforehand to get my balance to see that suddenly £72 had gone missing from my account that I knew that I'd got tickets for the final the following week. So that was a really big deal for me to go with my mate Chris to that game. We sat fairly low behind the goal. It was a dreadful football match. It was a really, really bad football match. It wasn't until Justin Edinburgh was sent off somewhat unjustly midway through the second half that the game actually sparked to life, and that actually galvanised me. I guess this was the George Graham effect, really. And we won the game. And I think for any neutral watching that game, the best thing about Alan Nilsson's 92nd minute winner was that it meant that we didn't have to have another 30 minutes of extra time, because it was just such a terrible football match as a spectacle. But look, we won a cup. It was the only time really that Spurs fans had any sort of appreciation for George Graham, but not totally, because they still wouldn't sing his name. It wasn't George Graham's blue and white army. It was the man in the raincoat's blue and white army, as he sort of walked round the side of Wembley back to the tunnel afterwards with the trophy.
It was a shocking game of football, really was. But that almost gets forgotten that we were semi-finalists in the FA Cup as well again that year. Lost to our bogey side in Newcastle in the semi-final with Alan Shearer scoring, I think, the one that came off the crossbar and spun.
Yeah,
was that at Old Trafford?
It was at Old Trafford.
Yeah,
and of course, talk about Tottenham injustices of modern time. That game as well, at 0-0, Nikos Dabis, as Newcastle centre half, jumped for a ball and almost caught it. And Paul Durkin, who was a good referee, didn't spot it, just didn't give it. And of course, no VAR at the time. Went to extra time, and Sol Campbell inexplicably did exactly the same thing in our penalty area, which Paul Durkin spotted and rightly gave the penalty, and Newcastle won that one 2-0. I would say of all the semi-finals we've lost, that's probably the least significant one. A, because we'd already won the League Cup, and secondly, if we'd have got through, we'd have played the Man United team that won the treble. So I can't see, even with George Graham's pragmatism in one-off games, that we would have won that one.
Yeah, 90s very much a roller coaster ride for Tottenham and all Tottenham fans. If you want to read more about Spurs into the 90s, Gareth's book is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack, Spurs in the 90s, Magic, Mayhem and Mediocrity. That's available with all good stockists. Before we call it a day on the podcast, we're just going to discuss a couple of bits from the international break. Quite a number of players away on international duty this month. I think the notable news, really, Lucas Bergvall returning early from Sweden duty. Minor injury, wasn't able to play Monday's game against Estonia. Brennan Johnson carried on his fantastic run in front of goal. 7 goals in 7 games now. He came off at halftime in the Iceland game as a precaution after feeling the impact of a kick. Pedro Porros had a very good international break as well. Played 90 minutes for Spain, got an assist yesterday against Serbia. Christian Romero, 90 minutes under his belt in Argentina's 6-1 win over Bolivia. He was suspended in the first game. Dominic Solanke getting about 18 minutes or so against Greece. Probably a bit disappointing not to get a bit more, really, in that game, because Lee Carsley not going with a striker for whatever reason.
So strange.
Yeah, but I think
it would be Watkins would be the one that's sitting on the bench thinking, why am I not starting here?
Yeah, most definitely. But we've seen the appointment of Thomas Tuchel as new England head coach, 18-month contract. So potentially more opportunities coming Solanke's way if he carries on doing what he's doing at Spurs. Really impressing in the front line at the moment. And hopefully those goals will continue to flow. Another couple of notable bits from the international roundup. Guglielmo Vicario started in Italy's 4-1 win over Israel, and then England under 21s. Dane Scarlett came off the bench yesterday, a goal and an assist in the 7-0 win over Azerbaijan. Some other news from yesterday, we've got the TV fixture schedule for December and January. fair to say I don't think Spurs fans will be happy with some of the kickoffs on offer. Bournemouth, 8:15 on the Thursday night, December the 5th. Not a good one for the travelling fans. And the same goes for Sunday, December the 15th, 7 p.m. kickoff away at Southampton.
Don't we play enough on Thursday nights?
Yeah, quite clearly. But there is another one on Thursday coming up on Boxing Day away at Nottingham Forest. So, yeah, Spurs, it pretty much is Thursday, Sunday football. A couple of the Sunday games. Chelsea at home, December the 8th. That's 4:30. Liverpool, 4:30 on the Sunday, December the 22nd. Got midweek North London derby coming up in January as well. Away at Arsenal. That's Wednesday, 15th of January. Kick-off at 8. Everton, that's 19th of January, 2 p.m. kickoff. That'll be another draw. Always seems to be a draw at Goodison at the moment. And then Leicester at home, Sunday, 26th of January. That's 2 p.m. West Ham this weekend. I think it's fair to say against Spurs need to get back to winning ways after that defeat at Brighton last time out. Absolutely.
Can't afford to drop more points really at this stage, and particularly against West Ham. So, yeah, you'd like to think the home form's not been too bad this year so far. So you'd like to think Spurs will pick up a result. Obviously, West Ham did have a good result before the international break against Ipswich. Hadn't started, but yeah, you'd like to think it'd be 3 points at home for Ange this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I watched West Ham recently against Chelsea probably a month ago, and I've never seen the team like just so open in midfield. The amount of times Chelsea were running through them. So hopefully Spurs can take full advantage of West Ham on Saturday. But they've actually won at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium last season. They've had a couple of decent results there previously. So London derby going to be a tough game. Ange will be speaking at Hotspur Way Friday for his press conference. So hopefully some positive news on the injury front regarding Son, Richarlison, Wilson-Odobert, and Bergvall and Johnson as well. Richarlison's been spotted back on the pitch at Hotspur Way during the international break. Not working with the team, seems to be working away from the team, doing a bit of ball work, though, in the photos that Spurs uploaded to their social media accounts. So, I mean, for you both, would you be making changes to the team to face West Ham this weekend?
I guess it ultimately depends what condition they all come back from international duty from. I mean, even if they're not carrying an injury, I don't know how late the last arrivals are going to be, but I would imagine that Sonny's probably the only one to come back in who you think might go into the starting 11. Feels like it's a relatively settled starting 11 that he's come across now, doesn't it? So,
aside. When we do kind of our predicted teams and stuff, I think the back five speaks for itself. The strongest back five is there for everyone to see, essentially. And I think the three that Ange's chosen in midfield, the attacking midfield that he's got now with Maddison, Kulusevski, and one other, Bentancur or Bissouma, essentially. So yeah, I think it's whether you play Bentancur or Bissouma, I think, in that kind of more holding role, and then if Sonny's back, I think he walks straight back into the team, essentially.
Yeah, I agree with you on Sonny. I think he'll just come in for Werner if he's fit and ready to go against West Ham. Bentancur didn't have the best of games at Brighton, but then again, not a lot of players did in the second half at all, given the capitulation. So probably a question mark over Bentancur and Bissouma, but what could tip things in Bentancur's favour is he's been playing well of late, and because of his international ban, he's had 2 weeks at Hotspur Way with Ange as well. So maybe he starts again. Then the only question I'd probably have is Romero at the back. I don't think he'll change it, but it's just a quick turnaround this week with Romero playing in the early hours of Wednesday morning for Argentina. You've got to travel back from South America, and then it's the early kickoff on Saturday. So maybe just needs to have a look at Romero, but personally, I can't see him changing that one.
No, the interesting thing for me, I think, moving forward will be, we've obviously spoken a lot on football.london about Destiny Udogie and the fact he's come back from an injury, didn't have a pre-season, and I think it's shown so far this season. He's had a few good displays, but in the main, I think he's kind of been a bit up and down at left back. And given the resurgence of Jed Spence, obviously he wasn't named in the Europa League squad, but does Ange trust him to start a Premier League game at left back and give Destiny Udogie a break when he's perhaps not quite at the peak of his powers? I say peak of his powers, he's only a young kid, but you know what I'm saying. Destiny was so good last season, his first season coming into the Premier League, but it's just had that little bit. The injury's probably taken its toll a little bit. It's going to be interesting to see how brave Ange is in throwing someone like Jed Spence in at that left back slot, I think.
Yeah, you would imagine after such a defeat at Brighton that you would make changes, but as you both said, it's pretty much really settled 11. And you can't see him making wholesale changes. But we'll see on Saturday. Before we call it a day on today's podcast, thanks to Gareth for coming in and speaking about Tottenham in the 90s. Really enjoyable chat, and I hope everyone did too. So thank you for coming on, Gareth.
No, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to promote the book. As you said, it's called "Is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack?" and it's available through all good outlets.
Brought back a lot of memories for me. Thank you very much for that, Gareth.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Same for me as well, especially in 95. So thank you for that. Thank you to everyone for listening in, and just keep with us at football.london for all your latest Tottenham news. To get the best discount off your NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/goldguest. Our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the podcast episode description box.